Welcome to the fifth and final video and the third behavior video where we're going to be talking about Neanderthal symbolic behavior. So what is the significance of symbolic behavior? So it is thought to be a uniquely human trait, or another way to think about it as defining modern human behavior. But as we'll see, symbolic behavior might not be so uniquely human, and by human I mean our species, Homo sapiens. So symbolic behavior can be defined as a socially constructed reality that can be communicated to others. So it is a reality that we humans or hominid individuals invent kind of apart from the physical world, and we can communicate that in a way where our abstract thoughts then can be kind of interpreted and put into the heads of others. So definitely uniquely human in terms of no other non-hominid species engage in this type of behavior. And there's all sorts of things associated with it, as we'll go over in this video. So an example of symbolic behavior is this rock engraving at Gibraltar. That's dated to 40,000 years ago. So again, Gibraltar is here, right? That's where that Neanderthal specimen is from. Not necessarily the same exact site, but the same country, Gibraltar. And so we see some gouges in this rock face, right? And maybe you can see it better here on the schematic photo or schematic image. And there's no real practical purpose for doing this, right? And so one way to demonstrate symbolic behavior is that if you can demonstrate there's no functional practical purpose, then it must be something, then it must be symbolic behavior and related to all those things I talked about on the previous slide, right? Basically art. Here is another example, La Pasiega Cave, located in Spain, dated to 50,000 years ago, which is 5,000 to 10,000 years before the arrival of Homo sapiens. So we could be fairly confident that this was made by a Neanderthal. And so here's the original cave face with the painting on it. And just so you can see it more clearly, here's an illustration of that. So no idea what's going on, definitely art, and your interpretation is as good as mine. Here's another example, Moltravieso Cave in Spain, dated to 40,000 years ago. And this type of cave art is actually my favorite. And so Homo sapiens did this too, which might make you think whether they came up with this independently or did one species teach the other. Who knows? Open question. But here you can't really see it. There are all these growths over it. But if you take a picture on another wavelength, you can see, well, what do you see here? So that's a hand, right? So the way this cave art is created is you basically place your hand on the wall and then you put paint, which you can make by mixing pigment with water or with fat. Some use, and we know this because there are modern groups today who still make cave art. Some use urine. But basically, you put the paint in your mouth. I guess that would be kind of gross if the paint was made of urine, but whatever. You put it in your mouth or you put it in like some bladder. And so with your hand on the wall, you basically blow and spray the paint over it. So you create this negative impression of your hand. So definitely art, definitely indicative of symbolic behavior. No real functional and pragmatic significance of doing this. Here's another really cool example. So perhaps an eagle claw necklace. So this is from that site of Krapina in Croatia, the oldest Neanderthal site, dated 130,000 years ago. It's the one that had all the butchered Neanderthal individuals, indicative of cannibalism. And you see a bunch of cut marks on these claws, right? And there's no meat on a claw, so there's no reason to cut up a claw. So by ruling out that functional, pragmatic side of it, they thought, well, they were incising the claw and creating these grooves so they could string, well, a string around it to create a necklace, right? Which is definitely indicative of symbolic behavior, decorating oneself, perhaps indicative of belonging to some type of group, perhaps. What about Neanderthal use of ochre? So ochre is a pigmented rock or dirt. And what people today use ochre for is when you find this pigmented rock, ochre, you can grind it up and you can mix it again with water, fat, urine, and you can paint yourself with it, right? And it's not used for camouflage, but it's used to mark yourself, right? Perhaps as saying, oh, I'm a part of the red group, as opposed to say the blue group, right? So symbolic behavior. This piece of ochre was found at the site, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, in the Netherlands, dated between 250 to 200,000 years ago. This particular ochre was transported dozens of kilometers. How do we know this? Well, ochres have a unique chemical signature. And so once you fingerprint that signature, you can then fingerprint sources all across the landscape to see where this particular piece came from. And we know this was transported at least dozens of kilometers. So quite a ways away, right? So that meant this ochre had to have been particularly special to make it worth it to travel this far to get it. Here's another example at a site Pech-Talazé in France, dated 50,000 years ago. This one's black ochre, and there are abrasion marks, so indicative of it being ground to create the powder with which to mix, fat, water, urine to create that paint. Today, though, ochre is also used for practical purposes like medicine, hide tanning, food preservation, and insect repellent. So just because we find ochre at these Neanderthal sites, we don't know for sure whether it was used for symbolic behavior, because there's also all of these functional purposes associated with it also. This is a really cool one. So they found a part of a cave bear femur, actually a cave bear cub, with holes punctured in it and the ends broken off. And so this is at a site called Divje, found in Slovenia, dated 43,000 years ago. And the discoverers and researchers thought that this actually served as a flute. So they took a part of a cave bear femur and fashioned it to create a flute with which they could play music, definitely indicative of symbolic behavior. And this is where I would show you in class a video of what the flute sounded like, so you can actually listen to the sounds of smooth Neanderthal flute jazz. But it doesn't work with these lecture videos. So here's the link, but I also embed it below the video on Canvas. However, as with virtually all evidence arguing for Neanderthal symbolic behavior, there are always naysayers. And this could totally be indicative of our society in general, still harboring these negative stereotypes when it comes to Neanderthals, thinking they're dull, dim-witted, brutish. In this case, for that flute, I'll just quote this researcher: "The cave bear cub femora with holes are in all cases neither instruments nor human-made at all." So what this researcher Dietrich thought was that that flute could have just as easily have been created by a carnivore. So carnivores will chew off the ends of bones, right? And the way their teeth puncture the shaft of the bone can create what look like those flute finger holes. So here's a better picture of that, right? This was either experiments or modern observations of modern carnivores feeding on femora, and they leave these tooth punctures, right? So that flute with the ends chewed off and carnivore tooth punctures, it could have been just that, a carnivore meal instead of a Neanderthal flute. What about speech, right? Where Neanderthal is able to talk. And this seems to be the pinnacle of symbolic behavior and is one of the hallmarks of defining modern human behavior, right? If we're talking about constructing a social reality and communicating to others, there's no better way to do that than speech, right? The concept of hot it being hot outside is a very abstract concept. Um, but me being able to say hot to you means I can envision hot, and I could basically plant that idea in your head just by speaking. So very special. Okay, back to the slide. So Neanderthal speech, did they have it? Well, Neanderthal hyoids were identical to those in humans. So this is the hyoid bone. This is where it sits in the throat, and it anchors the tongue. It sits right above the voice box, the larynx, so you can actually feel it in your throat right above the voice box. And this bone is actually broken during strangulation. So they often use that to diagnose people who have been strangled to death. Okay, so that was really morbid. But so here's a Neanderthal, right? Neanderthal hyoid, human hyoid. You can see they look identical. So this suggests that Neanderthals definitely had the anatomical machinery to produce speech. Here's another line of evidence. So this is a very zoomed in photo of the front side of an incisor, the upper incisor. And microscopically, there are all these striations, all these scores in the teeth, and they're all pretty much going in the same direction, right? So in this study, the 17 Neanderthals they looked at, 15 showed this pattern. So it's a pretty general pattern. This suggests that Neanderthals were right-handed, right? So if you remember from a previous video, Neanderthals often use their teeth to hold like skins or meat, which they butchered with tools, right? And so when you do that, especially when you're butchering close to your mouth, you can often accidentally just score your tooth with that stone tool. And you can imagine if you're holding a skin or meat with your teeth and you're right-handed, you're basically stroking down and towards your right side, right? Which is what's going on here. And so these patterns suggest that Neanderthals were predominantly right-handed. The remaining 2 out of 17 showed the opposite, suggesting that they were left-handed. Either way, Neanderthals had a dominant hand, which is not found in the animal kingdom, and it suggests brain laterality, right? So those of us that are, let's say, right-handed, you're left brain dominant. And those of us that are left-handed, like me, were right brain dominant. Having one dominant side of the brain, that's what brain laterality is, and that is the precondition for speaking. So you can see this kind of chain of logic, right? If we see all these striations going in one direction, indicative or created when Neanderthals were holding skins or meat in their teeth and butchering them, that suggests handedness, which suggests brain laterality, which then suggests that Neanderthals did speak. So between this and the hyoid, there's some pretty decent evidence that Neanderthals did have speech. And so in conclusion, as I mentioned in a previous video, I think one of the main messages of this lecture is that Neanderthals were like us in many ways, right? Again, the bowler hat example, if they said if Neanderthals were living today, you just stuck a hat on them to hide the low receding forehead, they would look pretty much like us. I showed you that rugby player, which looks like a Neanderthal. They practice symbolic behavior. I think the necklace is quite convincing, right? Those cut marks, there's no reason to cut mark claws. The rock art and cave art paintings, super convincing of symbolic behavior. So Neanderthals look like us and they behaved like us. So not quite the dull, dim, brutish stereotypes that have been foisted upon them due to these older reconstructions and dioramas, and ultimately, again, due to Boole's reconstruction and interpretation of that Neanderthal skeleton. Okay, so that concludes our lecture on Neanderthals. Went over the history of their discovery, and that's kind of where we first saw those negative stereotypes coming in. Went over the anatomy, and because Neanderthals have such a rich archaeological record for behavior, we devoted 3 videos to that, right? So lots of behaviors, huge uptick compared to archaic Homo. And yes, so next lecture will be our own species, modern humans.